Welcome to the Grow People podcast with Pastor Jason. That's that guy with new spectacles.
New, yeah. Apparently, they're hip and cool. So I've been told.
Who told you that?
My 18-year-old son.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, so that's some cred right there.
Yeah, if you're not watching this on YouTube, they're more of a clear frame.
They are clear,
but they're not
smoke is what they're called.
Smoke, but they're not the white clear. They're the clear frame, which I'm not a big fan of. Of course, there's people listening that may have those glasses. They look great on you.
Oh, they look super cool on some people. Yeah. Well, it's just like anything. You reach a point to where, I mean, there's certain things I shouldn't wear as a 43-year-old dude. And so, yeah, clear glasses might be one of those things that 60-year-old dudes shouldn't wear.
Maybe.
I don't know. I don't know who writes these rules.
I don't know. Yeah. If I knew a 60-year-old, but they look great.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
All right.
Well, I'm trying them out. Just got them, and we'll see. I got to preach in them and see if they hold up.
Okay. Same prescription?
Yeah. Same prescription. I just got them because they're the transition lenses. Mm-hmm. Like when you go outside, they get darker. And when we played at the what are you laughing about?
Nothing. Go ahead. Continue.
Well, we played golf at the tournament for Must Ministries a couple weeks ago. I had sunglasses, but they're not prescription. Mm-hmm. And so it was one of the reasons why I played so bad in golf. That's the reason, not because I stink at it, because I couldn't see well.
All right.
So then I thought, well, I was like, I got to get me some prescription sunglasses. But then I thought, I can just get them with these kind of lenses and I can use them more than just for sunglasses. So we'll see.
So you're going to be the guy that walks into a place. Who's that guy with the sunglasses on?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, it's not sunny right now today as we're recording this. It's cloudy outside. So as of right now, they haven't really darkened up when I've gone outside. So I'm waiting to see because I'm worried they might be defective. So,
well, I'm wondering if you did need a new pair of glasses because your old ones seem to be a little loose on you.
Yeah.
Because during your messages, you often go to the arms of the glasses and pull them back up. Yeah. Or is that just a quirk?
That's just because my head has gotten fatter. Yeah. My head has gotten rounder and I'm sweating more. So, how they have the springs in there in the glasses and they spread out. I think my glasses have just given up trying to hold it in.
Pulling back the curtain. Speaking of sweating, a couple of weeks ago we had a power outage. That's why we didn't have a Thursday night gathering. And unbeknownst to us, until the weekend, that power outage had knocked out some of our air conditioning units. Yeah. So we were limping into Sunday with 3.5 of our 4 auditorium units, and it was warm. It was warm on stage, and I had no idea whether you had your sweat rag in the podium like it always is, but I brought one and I had it next to me just in case, and I was going to throw it up like you were Elvis.
Yeah, you should have. You should have just waved it. It's like the terrible towel. Just wave it at me. Yeah.
All right. The Grow People podcast is for the purpose of
growing people.
Growing people.
I was wondering. I didn't know if we said that.
We didn't. We skipped right through it.
And I said growing people.
Yeah, it's not it.
I know.
Yeah, growing would be a completely different acronym.
It would be.
You'd have to come up with something for ING.
ING, yeah.
Grow is, or should we say grows, so it would fit in the Wordle. No, let's not go there. My name's David Stein. I'm the campus pastor at our Canton location, and it is great fun to do this podcast. Last podcast, we hit a pretty heavy topic of abortion. We get a lot of great feedback on that. And one of the consistent pieces of feedback that we received was, thank you for clarifying not only the church's position, but how do we respond to these things as believers?
Yeah.
And it's not that we, have a bunch of people that don't know where we stand. It's just, it's always good to reference it and to explain it. So today we are going to explain something. As you may have seen on your Google Calendar, if you use Google Calendar or you walk into any store this month, it is LGBTQ plus month.
Yeah, first day, June 1st.
And lots of questions about, hey, not only where does the church stand, but also how do we respond to people as believers? So let's start out with this is a month that it seems to believers as an agenda is being thrown at those who disagree.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that that is important to understand, because I think agenda is a good word. I mean, the Bible talks a lot about the the systems of the world, mm-hmm. and there's things that we're called to resist. Like sin, flesh, the devil, the world. And so there definitely are world systems at play, mm-hmm. And they have been throughout human history. And yeah, I do think that, I think one of the toughest things for us as Christians is, and this is really in modern day America, is and this is a unique struggle for, I think, Christians in America, where it's not in other parts of the world. Mm-hmm. For the vast majority, actually for the majority of Christians, because the majority live outside of the U.S., they understand this culturally in a way that I think it's harder for Americans to understand, because in most cultures of the world, Christianity is not and has not been the predominant belief system. Mm-hmm. It hasn't been the kind of the backbone of the moral makeup of the culture, to where in America it is. It is. I mean, whether you believe in God or not, our founding documents, so much of it was influenced by the Bible, was influenced by Christian thought, by Western. They wouldn't have said evangelical back then because mm-hmm. it didn't exist, but definitely Christendom,
right?
And so for us in America, we have, especially people that are not that are maybe older than 20 or what, I don't what phrase or age there is, but there is this kind of like collective memory we have as mm-hmm. Americans sure. of how things were. And it's not like they were all good back then.
Yeah.
Because we have a bad history in America of, like I said a few weeks ago, being on the wrong side of truth, mm-hmm. Particularly things like slavery and civil rights and different things. But at the same time, there was this kind of agreed upon moral makeup in our country about what marriage was, about human sexuality, mm-hmm. those kinds of things. And so that has definitely shifted. Mm-hmm. It has shifted. And so, and as culture shifts, there's drivers of culture, just like anything. There's innovators or influencers, and there's people who follow along because that's where they see that's where the culture is going. So now the culture has gone that way, and then a lot of companies and businesses and groups are seeing that's where the culture is going, so they're going that way. So it definitely feels like an agenda. And spiritually speaking, I would say in a lot of ways it is. Mm-hmm. There is an agenda to normalize things that the Bible would say are abnormal, or immoral, which we'll get into that. But yeah, I think it's no longer a subset of culture. Mm-hmm. It is the mainstream.
So what we want to talk about today is, just as we talked through abortion in the last podcast, mm-hmm. Where is the church's stance, and what does the Bible say, and how do we as believers walk through a world today that is different than it was before?
Yeah. I think the biggest place to start, like if we had somebody here, I was just watching an interview with Tim Keller, who's one of our heroes, and the guy asked him like a point blank question. And this is kind of where the world starts. And the question is always like, well, are homosexual people going to hell? Mm-hmm. Is homosexuality a sin? Mm-hmm. And that's the starting place. And so the reason why I bring that up is I don't think it's helpful to start there.
Right.
Because it's framed in such a way that makes it feel like, and I was watching this with Tim Keller just the other day, and he said, well, I can tell you this, it doesn't mean that all heterosexuals are going to heaven,
Yeah.
Because we're starting from a place of sexuality.
Sure.
Like we're talking about sexuality as if, and this is what I would say is the biggest issue in culture, we have placed sexuality at the center, like as an identity question. Mm-hmm. Our sexuality frames our identity.
Right.
To where the real issue, and then we talk about orientation, which is where the word comes from, homo it means same.
Mm-hmm.
And then we, put the word sexual on, so it's same sex, so we're talking about an orientation. I'm orientated this way sexually. But to where I think it's helpful to back up and say, at the end of the day, the biggest problem culturally is not a sexuality one, it's a spiritual one.
Mm-hmm.
It is our orientation, not sexually, it's our orientation spiritually.
Right.
And to use the similar terms, which is quite ironic, none of us are straight.
Mm-hmm.
And we use that term today talking about sexuality. If you're straight, that
right.
means you like the opposite
mm-hmm.
sex. If you're not, you don't. And I think it's important to start there, because I think there's been a lot of damage done
Sure.
when we just start with sexuality and then single people out as if people that are same-sex attracted are somehow worse or different than the quote-unquote normal person. To where what the Bible says, to your original, well, that was your original question, right? What does the Bible talk about this?
Yeah. What's our stance as a church? What does the Bible say, and how do we respond to it as believers?
Where the Bible would say, and the reason why I'm starting here is because I think it's, again, important to start here. The Bible would say is all of us have the wrong orientation spiritually.
And that's what he meant by none of us are straight.
Yeah, none of us are straight. And where I'm coming from that phrase.
Versus crooked.
We
are crooked. And you mentioned that in John chapter 12.
Yes. And that's where, in Martin Luther, who said this the best, the Latin phrase, homo incurvatus se, which is we are curved in on ourself.
Mm-hmm.
And so the problem with the human heart is, and this is true of all humans, is we are all curved. And that's what I meant by straight. Yeah, none of us are in line with God. None of us are right. All of us are bent. All of us are crooked. All of us start from a place when it comes to our life with God. We all start from a place of crookedness. And the reason why I think it's important to start there is because I think as Christians, a lot of times we can be very hypocritical and judgmental towards people who would believe differently than us sexually. And we have the idea that they're not straight, but we are. And that's where it's not helpful to define terms strictly by sexuality. Mm-hmm. That's the problem, is we have to start back and say, no, the problem is not sexual as much as it is spiritual. We have a spiritual problem. All of us have a sinful orientation.
Yes, no doubt.
And that's just the truth. I mean, that's the essence of the gospel. So since that's the case, since all of us have that, then I would say that shows up in our sexuality. It shows up. So we're all fundamentally broken. None of us are in line with God. We're all curved in on ourselves. That's what Romans 1 says, which is one of the great Bible texts dealing with this issue. But what I'm saying is Romans it talks about there's the problem and then the symptom.
Mm-hmm.
There's the cause, and the problem is we traded God. We traded God as the center, put ourselves as the center. That's the problem. And that's what I'm saying. We're all bent. None of us are in line with God. Then that shows up in our sexuality. But it's very, again, it can come off very hypocritical to the world as Christians when we only point out other people's brokenness and not our own.
Right. But that's what we do.
That's what we do.
Yeah.
And again, I think that's where it's important to back up as Christians and say, I mean, everybody is sexually broken in some way. Mm-hmm. I mean, because we're spiritually broken. And so my spiritual brokenness shows up in my sexual brokenness. I don't know if I've ever counseled or talked to somebody that didn't have some type of baggage in their life due to their choices regarding sexuality. Because it's just a fundamental way that we express ourselves. Because, there's a difference between sex and intimacy, which is a helpful frame, and we can talk about that later. Sex is a means to an end. And the end is intimacy. The end is relationship. And God made us for relationship. And so all of us fundamentally want to be in relationships. And then we use sexuality, which is, God created, just like we talked about last week, the primary purpose of sex was procreation. God wasn't pleasure, it's procreation. So that's why man and woman fit together, biologically speaking. So that was the purpose. And sex becomes a means to an end for not only procreation, but intimacy with another person. The two become one. So since that's the case, we're all searching for intimacy is my point, but we think sex and sexuality will get us there, but it won't in and of itself. So sexuality, when we devoid it of our spiritual brokenness and when we separate it out from God's good design for us, then it becomes the end. Mm-hmm. And then it becomes my identity. And that's the biggest problem with the current thought in the world is people define themselves as their core identity by their sexuality. Not, I do this, but I am this. Mm-hmm. And that's where, and I'm going to answer your question, that's where it becomes sin, is it's a matter of identity. You know, when we come to Christ, we die to ourselves, we live in Christ, and now Christ is the center of my identity. He is the one that informs every other area of my life, including my sexuality. So it's one thing for someone to be a Christian who's struggling with their sexuality. It's a whole different thing to say, no, I am this sexually, and then that informs my Christianity. Mm-hmm. That is sin.
Right.
Because that's idolatry. And that's what makes this one particularly hard to see, because at the end of the day, someone or something is going to be at the core of who I am, mm-hmm. my identity. And if my identity is not Christ, but it is my sexuality, and then I try to fit Christ into that, then I have traded something else at the center. And we can't fit Jesus into our life. He is our life. And I think that is the problem that we're seeing culturally we're really seeing an identity swap, an identity confusion. And that's so we're really seeing the outworkings of a spiritual orientation problem working itself out sexually.
So it takes a much bigger thought process to get to what you just explained.
Yeah.
As opposed to a very thin look at mm-hmm. something. And I can compare a very thin look as, all right, somebody posts something on social media, you have an opinion of that person, that's the identity you've placed on that person. Mm-hmm. A thick look at somebody would be, hey, I'm building a relationship with them, and I'm going to go deeper with them, and I'm going to find out who they are so I don't identify them just by what they posted on the Facebook. Mm-hmm. So what you're saying is we have to have a much bigger thought process to LGBTQ, mm-hmm. to where the Bible said what the Bible says about it, what our response is to it, mm-hmm. rather than just putting a label on it and saying, "Hey, that's sin."
Yeah, exactly. And I'm not saying that the Bible I'm not saying it's not sin, because the Bible,
correct.
The Bible, here's what the Bible says. And, you hear this argument a lot. People are like, well, Jesus never talked about it. Mm-hmm. Jesus never talked about same-sex marriage or homosexuality, so why do you care? Well, here's what Jesus did talk about. Jesus affirmed the Genesis 1 model, that God created male and female, mm-hmm. and he told them to multiply. A father leaves his mother, is joined together with his wife. So he affirms that. Mm-hmm. And then he says the word sexual immorality, which, interestingly enough, that word there is the Greek word porneia. It's where we get our English word pornography. So what the Bible says about human sexuality is any sex outside of a marriage relationship between a man and a woman is sexual immorality. Mm-hmm. So that includes same-sex relationships. That also includes heterosexual relationships that are not in marriage.
Yep.
That also includes pornography. I mean, I've heard one theologian say the word sexual immorality or porneia is like a junk drawer term. Mm-hmm. In the Greek, there's a lot of things that go into that,
Sure.
that drawer.
Yep.
So definitely, biblically speaking, again, and this is why it's important to back up, like I said, it's a core question of identity. Who gets to speak into my sexuality? Does God get to define my sexuality?
Mm-hmm.
Because if I'm a Christian, then God gets to define everything in my life.
That's right.
God gets to say and set what is true and what I obey in my life. So he's the center.
Mm-hmm.
And God is the one who created marriage. God is the one who created humans. So marriage, by definition, is not something that the state defines. And that's one interesting thing about this whole thing is the state has never defined marriage. It just accepted what is true, or what was acceptable as true, what the Bible defines as marriage. The state just acknowledged it. And the reason why the state acknowledged it, and the reason why we want the state to acknowledge marriage, is because there's consequences to marriage, i.e. children. Like the state doesn't recognize a friendship between two people. Like this is an official thing. We need to put it on the books. Why? Because a friendship between two people doesn't result in a child. But the state recognized marriage because a man and a woman coming together can procreate, like God says, and therefore has an offspring. Well, the state has an interest in recognizing that, because if not, then those two people can come together and have a baby and say, I don't want the baby, and just throw it on the side of the road. Mm. And none of us want to live in a world where the state doesn't say, no, that's wrong. There's consequences. You can't do that. And if you don't take care of your child, we'll take your child away from you. So that's why the state recognizes marriage. But again, the reason why the state recognized it in that, or how they recognize it, was the biblical definition, because God is the one who defines marriage. Mm-hmm. And every culture throughout human history had that definition. Mm-hmm. Like there was always offshoots of that. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? But the standard has been that.
And here's an interesting aspect of that, and you may be listening right now. Okay, well, that's good. That's where the church stands, and yes, God does get to speak into our sexuality.
Yeah.
But God gets to speak into, as you said, every aspect of our lives.
Every aspect. How
we love our neighbors, how we love our enemies, how generous we are. Mm-hmm. And I'm convicted here, and I just want to ask this question. Hey, think about something that you're not letting God speak into your life about.
Yeah.
That he says about.
And that's what I was trying to say. That's why I wanted to start where we started earlier, mm-hmm. because again, I think as Christians, we'll try to stand up as cultural warriors, as it's been said, and say that this is marriage, but yet we can't recognize the greed in ourselves. Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Tim Keller said this. In his 30 plus years of pastoring, he never had anybody walk into his office as a pastor and say, Pastor, I need to confess my greed, because you can't see it.
Right.
It is so hard to see, but there's other things that we can see, and we can definitely point it out in others. And that's why, again, we're all bent.
Yep.
We all have brokenness that's going to show up in our life. It may not show up in our sexuality like it does for some people, which we can talk about same-sex attraction, because I think that's important, but it shows up in my life when it comes to money, or it comes to pride, or it comes to even lust, mm-hmm. or whatever. And so all of us fundamentally have that. And so that is the point of Romans 1. We've all traded out, the God, and put the creation, mm-hmm. which is ourself. So yeah, all of us have to start with that. Because again, this is why Jesus railed so much against the Pharisees, because at the root of their sin was self-righteousness. Well, how many Christians need to repent of their own self-righteousness because they've pointed out the sexual brokenness in others, but wrongly thought since they weren't like those people, yep. then they are good. Well, that's self-righteous.
Right. You're listening to the Grow People podcast, another commercial-free episode. They're all commercial.
It did sound like you were going to say brought to you by. Yeah.
When we get 1 million downloads, there's going to be some commercials.
Yeah.
No, there won't. So that was a great foundational outlook on LGBTQ and what the Bible says. But let's get into some practical things, because these are questions that our people here at Revolution ask on a regular basis in pastoral care sessions, conversations in the hallway. Hey, I got invited to this wedding. What do I do? There's all kinds of things, but you brought up same-sex attraction. So let's start there, because somebody may be listening with a family member who is same-sex attracted, or same-sex attracted themselves.
Yeah. And I think this is important, and I've said this a few times in different messages, but the church, and I'm not just speaking Revolution Church, I'm speaking broader, wasn't doing a good job for a while understanding the difference. And I didn't even really understand this as a younger pastor, that, we don't choose our struggles. We are born into this world broken. Again, that's what I was saying. We're all bent. None of us are straight. And orthodoxy, we've said ortho is straight, doxy is doctrine, so it's straight doctrine. None of us were born with that. We all had to be saved and recreated, reborn into a new person. And so all of us have brokenness, and that brokenness is going to express itself. And a lot of it expresses itself in our sexuality, because we are relational people that are looking for intimacy.
Yep.
And we use sex as a means to do that. So my point in saying that is, it's okay if someone is same-sex attracted. And we can affirm that. We can affirm you really feel that.
Yes.
And the fact that you feel that, we recognize is not probably something you didn't choose. There may be a part of you that was maybe life experiences or just how you're wired or whatever, where, again, your own sinfulness, your own brokenness is expressing itself in this way. So to be a same-sex attracted person, in and of itself, is not sin in the sense of just because, like Jesus says, like in your anger, do not sin. Just because I may have anger, I haven't sinned yet. In the same way I may lust or I may want something that is wrong. It's when I think on it, dwell on, because Jesus did say, if you think it in your heart, So if someone is same-sex attracted, it's no different than someone who is different sex attracted, attracted to the opposite sex, but has to resist that, And I think this is a very important point, is because the prevailing thought is in modern world is like, well, that's cruel. It's cruel to tell someone who's same-sex attracted that they must deny themselves, that they must deny their chance at intimacy. And that's where we have to be clear. No. We're not saying you have to deny intimacy. What we are saying is you do have to deny your sexuality, though. But all of us have to do that.
Sure.
And that's where this gets framed incorrectly. We talked about this a few weeks ago in the message when Jesus said, whoever loves his life will lose it. But whoever loses or hates his life for my sake will gain it. And it's a whole idea of self-denial. And I made the point, being a seed is about self-denial. Jesus radically calls all of us to self-denial. All of us. So the call on a same-sex attracted person to self-denial is the same call on any person with any issue. All of us are called to self-denial. So to single out someone who is same-sex attracted to say somehow the Bible has a call on their life, that it doesn't have a call on someone else's is a misunderstanding. We are all called to deny ourselves, to take up our cross and follow him. And one of the greatest, I think, people alive today who's talking about this, a really good, strong believer named Sam Alberry. Yep. And he's from the UK. He is a same-sex attracted male who has written quite a few books now. And you just Google him and find out about it. He's the one who really helped me understand this, because he's a believer, he's a teacher, but yet he is same-sex attracted, and he's the one who really helps paint this in just a really amazing biblical approach to say, oh, it's no different. Like the call of God on his life is no different than the call of God on our life. We're all called to radical self-denial. And I think it's important. This is why I was saying earlier, the failure with the world is to say, but yeah, you're telling that person to deny not themselves in action, but deny themselves as a person. Mm. And that's where we've taken a more worldly approach to this, is because, again, my sexual orientation is not my identity. And the reason why that's so important is because Jesus said, in heaven, we will not be in marriage, we will not be given to marriage, we'll be like the angels. Which means in heaven, we will not be sexual beings.
That's correct, yes.
Because again, the purpose of sex is procreation. Well, once we're in the new heaven and the new earth, there's no point anymore. So imagine this, and this is hard for a secular mind to imagine. In heaven, we will have complete intimacy, but no sex.
Mind blown.
Yeah. Well, but heaven is breaking into earth now. And so we can have that now, not fully. And so therefore, if your sexuality is your personhood, then what you're saying is who you are as a person, your sexual identity or orientation is your identity. Well, that won't last in eternity. And that's the failure of our modern mind to differentiate the two between my identity and my sexuality. And so we are not asking someone to deny their identity, because their identity is in Christ. Mm-hmm. But we are asking someone to deny their sexuality, because their sexuality is not their identity. It is how they express themselves relationally, romantically. But again, that's outside of what God says is good for human flourishing.
So that's pretty clear, but the worldview would say that's intolerant. Mm-hmm. The worldview would say just love people. We know what God says about loving people. He's pretty clear about that. Mm-hmm. So I think we have to ask the question, what does that even look like? Mm-hmm. Because this whole mantra of the intolerance of Christians can be flipped around.
Yeah.
That people are intolerant of Christians simply because Christians are speaking the truth about God's word.
Yeah, it's funny because the word intolerance has been hijacked because the people who preach tolerance are the most intolerant people a lot of times.
Right.
Tolerance by definition is I don't have to agree with you to assign you dignity, value, and worth.
Correct.
We can agree to disagree on something, but I still love you as a person. And that's where the world says, well, that's intolerant. Well, we could say right back, well, you're being intolerant.
I have said that.
Yes, because intolerance is not, you must believe like me. Or tolerance is not, you must believe like me. Tolerance by definition means I'm tolerating you.
Yes.
And the best way to think about this, and you're talking about love, and we were talking about this a second ago, unequivocally, yes, the Bible calls us to love our neighbor. I mean, Jesus radically, when they said, what's the greatest commandment? He gave them two, love God and love people. He said, and the second one is on the level of the first. So by definition, being a Christian, being a gospel-centered person is, I'm taking myself out of the center. I'm putting Christ there. And also I am loving my neighbor as myself. I am loving my neighbor. But loving someone doesn't mean lying to them.
That's good. Write that down, folks.
Yes.
Loving someone does not mean lying to them.
No. And again, this kind of goes back to the whole Christendom culture that we were talking about before. And it's funny because we get this when it comes to, like, if my neighbor, let's just say my neighbor is a Muslim who lives next to me. Well, I am called to be the most loving person that Muslim has ever experienced.
Because you're his literal neighbor.
Because I'm his literal neighbor. Yes. I am called to love him. But again, loving doesn't mean I lie to him. In the sense of, like, in order to love him, I don't have to agree. and his theology or her theology, because there's clear differences between Muslims and Christians. They are both monotheistic religions, but completely different. Like Muslims don't believe in a Trinity. It's just one God. Jesus wasn't the Son of God. He was a prophet. There is clear differences. They have a different book, everything. But we get that as Christians. Like I don't have to agree that what he or she thinks is true. I don't have to agree that that's true in order for me to love them.
So how does this play out in real life? So we all have somebody in our life that is same-sex attracted or living in a homosexual lifestyle. I have a friend in New York, and he asked me one time, he goes, do you think this is wrong? Do you think this is sin? I said, yeah, but I love you. So told him the truth and still loved him, because here's where I wrestle with. I want to be the guy that 5-10 years from now, when he starts to wrestle with this, that he feels safe with. Yeah. So I don't know if that's the way to approach it.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I think what Christians struggle with is, again, it's the whole of what they're affirming. It's what we were talking about earlier. I can affirm someone who has same-sex attractions. Hey, I understand. Like that's a real thing. That's not fake. You feel that. I can affirm your feelings, but I do not have to condone them.
Right.
And that's the difference. Jesus with the woman who was caught in adultery, he didn't condemn her. He says, is there anyone here to condemn you? She says, no. And he says, neither do I. But then he says, go and sin no more. So yes, our neighbors, whoever our neighbors are, whether they're Muslims or whether they're in a same-sex relationship, whether they're transgender, whatever it is, we are not called to take a posture towards them of condemnation.
That's right.
We are not called to condemn them. We are called to love them. But again, love them doesn't mean I have to affirm their decisions. And I think that's where we have to be really clear as Christians, because the prevailing thought is, well, no, we have to affirm their lifestyle, affirm their choices. No, I don't have to. In order to love them, I don't have to lie. I don't have to believe a lie. And that's where the culture, which we talk a lot about, the phrase, my truth, your truth. No, there's only the truth. And Jesus is the truth. John 14:6. It's not just a principle, it's a person. So Jesus defines what is true. So again, Jesus defines marriage. Jesus defines sexuality. He defines everything that is true. But my neighbor, more often than not, is not going to believe that as true. Well, I don't have to condemn them for not believing that's true, but I have to love them and be, again, if we were a Christian in a foreign country, we wouldn't just go around tweeting about how we're condemning everybody or holding up signs saying everybody's going to hell.
Right.
Because we would know we're not the mainstream culture. We're not the mainstream belief system. Like if I'm going to pack up and move to Egypt, it's dominated by Muslims. So I'm not going to go around condemning all the Muslims, because Christianity is not the major cultural stream. Well, in our current American culture, Christianity is not the current major cultural stream anymore. So we have to change our tactic of thinking. We're trying to preserve culture, and we are called to be salt. And so there is a preservative element to that, no doubt. But I cringe a little, though, when people say, but we're just called to love them. But what do you mean by that?
Yes.
What do you mean by love them?
Because it's a definition that you really have to explore, simply because what you just said about using Christianity is almost a hammer, which is offensive.
Yeah.
Yes, the gospel is offensive, so we know that. But Christians can turn off the person that they're called to love simply by using Christianity as the hammer.
Yeah, and just telling them that what they're doing is wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. So my friend in New York, we had lengthy conversations, and when it finally came down to it, and I used the words, I can affirm this is how you feel.
Yeah.
And I understand that. But to approve, if you're asking me to approve, I can't.
No.
But I am here for you.
Absolutely. And that's a good way. We can affirm feelings without approving actions.
And you can actually do that when you have relationship.
Yeah.
One of the things that back in the old radio days,
Back in the old days,
2018.
That was definitely old days now. Yeah.
Leanne and I were hosting a morning show, and it was when Chick-fil-A was getting a lot of heat.
Yeah.
Because Dan Cathy had come out and said, hey, this is what we believe marriage is.
Exactly.
Okay. So that day, there was this unofficial push for Christians to go out and support Chick-fil-A.
Yeah.
And people were going out and going to Chick-fil-A, which is fine, buying their number one, taking a picture and putting it on their Facebook and saying, I support Chick-fil-A.
Yeah.
And I went on the radio the next morning. I said, Christians, stop it.
Yeah.
And I got some heat from that. I said, stop it. Because if you have anybody who is a friend of yours on Facebook that you are a witness to, who does not believe what you believe, you have lost your influence with them. And that's what we're getting at. There has to be a relational component to this in order to be able to say, I affirm, but I don't approve.
Yeah, and that's why I was talking so much about the cultural element, because again, if those same Christians lived in the Middle East and something like that happened, they wouldn't do that because they would understand it was hurting their missionary movement.
Yes.
It was hurting their mission of telling people about Jesus. But we, in our culture, have misunderstood what we're trying to do. We're not trying to make the culture Christian in that sense. We are trying to make Christians. We're trying to lead people to Christ. And if we lead people to Christ, then yes, the culture can become more Christian.
Right.
But that's a result. That's an effect of a culture that is becoming more people becoming like Christ, then the culture is becoming more Christian. But we're just reacting to the culture becoming less Christian and forgetting our main purpose of trying to make people Christians.
That's good.
And so by trying to preserve a Christian culture, we're actually losing our influence to make Christians.
Yes.
Which works against what we're trying to do.
Yes, we got one message that we are to be eager, unashamed, and under obligation to present.
Yeah, Romans 1.
And that is the good news. And for it to be news, it's got to be delivered.
Yeah.
Not by what you think about how somebody is living.
Yeah.
So let's get into some more of the practical questions. We get these. I got invited to a same-sex wedding.
Yeah.
What do I do? There's a school of thought. Well, if I go, I continue to preserve that relationship, and maybe down the road they'll come to me and ask me questions. If I don't go, I'm breaking that relationship, but I am standing my ground and staying in integrity. It's a wrestle.
It is. And this is one of those things that I don't want to be definitive on. And what I mean by that is I'll tell you my opinion, but people will disagree with me, and that's okay. And I wouldn't, if they disagree with me, I wouldn't say they're not Christians because if their heart is to remain relationally connected to someone. So how I have counseled people in that situation is my counsel to them is to say to that person, I love you, and I am here for you, but I will not be attending your wedding because that is me approving. And I've heard this. I've had conversations with other pastors that are like, well, you would go to a non-Christian wedding. You know, you would go to a wedding of, two unbelievers. And I said, yes, I would if it was a man and woman, because that's marriage still. It's just not a Christian marriage. But when it's a same-sex couple, it's not marriage from a biblical definition.
Right.
And that's the difference. And so therefore I am approving of something that is no longer the truth. And again, this is the hard part, is we are in the battle for two things. We are in the battle for truth and people's hearts. And so sometimes in the battle, we have to stand up for truth because we believe that the truth is what changes people's hearts. But sometimes in an effort to win people's hearts, we don't stand up for the truth. And that's where this is tough. And that's why I said, this is my opinion. People can disagree with me. But my response to that question is I'm going to stand up for the truth because that's the best to change their heart. So I'm standing up for it because I think that's what's best for that person, my family member or friend who's engaging in something that's not true, because the culture doesn't get to define what's true. And so therefore, that's why I would say, no, I would not attend a wedding because it is approving of something that is not true.
You've said something to me a couple of times over the years. If we don't stand for something, we stand for nothing.
Yeah.
And that's a statement that we make when we do stand for something.
It is. And I think that's the point I'm trying to make. And that's where we do have to understand the broader cultural implications. Like we started out this about an agenda. There is definitely an agenda from other spiritual powers, not of God, that are trying to redefine truth. And I've been reading an article about creating pseudo realities, and the manipulation tactic to create pseudo realities for people. And that's what I'm saying is reality is marriages between a man and a woman. And so therefore, if I approve of something that's a pseudo reality, it's not true, right, then I am approving something that the culture is saying, well, this is what's true. And we're saying, no, that's not true. And that's where we have to be as Christians. We do have to have this deep conviction that what is best for someone is the truth, which is why I said earlier, loving someone is not lying to them. Because if I love you and you're an alcoholic or whatever, I'm going to affirm your feelings, but I'm not going to approve of your actions because that's not what's best for you. What's best for you is not lying to you about that.
And it's hard.
It's hard.
It's hard because, there's the thought, well, if I don't do this, if I don't go to this wedding, my son, my daughter, whatever, is going to remember that for the rest of their lives. And that's why what you just said was so important. You have to have that conviction that the truth is more important than how they feel about you.
Yeah.
And that's what I've, just in witnessing to my own family. I'm like, I care more about your soul than what you think about me.
Yep.
And I think that's where we have to land.
Which is why I land there on that particular question. Because, you're right. I've dealt with this in my own family. And I have family members that they know that I disagree about their actions, but they also know I love them. And I still see them and we talk and we, but I don't have to approve. And again, that's the problem with the mass psychology that we're having. Yeah, this is going to be a long episode. In this moment, it's like, well, if you don't approve of my actions, then you don't love me. Okay. Well, let's take that thought to its logical consequence.
This is good. Yeah.
Yeah. So is it okay for me to have a relationship with a minor? Is it okay for a 60-year-old man to have a relationship with a 12-year-old?
Watch what age you put in
exactly.
there.
Exactly. What, a 43-year-old man to have a relationship with a 10-year-old? Well, no. Well, why? That's how I feel.
Right.
And if you don't affirm how I feel, then you're doing violence to me. So, well, we all have a line. And the problem with the culture that we have now is we have so disconnected ourselves from the truth that now the logical consequence of that is, well, if I feel it, it must be true. And what we're saying is, no, you don't have to believe everything you think and you don't have to live everything you feel. Because if you disconnect yourself from some reality, then you are now creating pseudo realities and you're asking us to live in your pseudo reality. I mean, whether it is same-sex attraction, whether it's transgender, whether it is people, there's, a whole movement now of furries, of people thinking that they are an animal. The logical outworking of that thought is like, well, all of that's on the table now.
Yeah. And if you're listening and you think that's a joke, no, it's not a joke.
But no, it's for real.
Yeah. Yeah, people go to conventions. Though you could be at a hotel just with your family, minding your own business, and somebody walks in as a squirrel.
Yeah.
Not in a squirrel suit. They're not a team mascot for a minor league baseball team.
Yeah.
They think they're a squirrel.
They think they're a squirrel, which interestingly enough, because we've talked, and we could talk a whole lot. We haven't even really gotten into transgender, but people are trying to separate out sex and gender, biological sex versus gender, and the thought that gender is a social construct, which is a very new thought. And people claim it's science. But biblically speaking, sex and gender are the same thing. And God created two, male and female. He created them. There is a male gender sex. There is a female gender sex. And that is determined a lot of things by our biology, our DNA, our ability to reproduce, all those things. Well, if we detach that, then we're saying, well, we can switch gender or we can be a different thing, But interestingly enough, it's like, but we don't do this with race. We don't see people of one race saying I'm transracial. It's like, well, no, because that's not a social construct. That is who you are. If you're black, you're black. You're white, you're white. Which ironically, a few years ago, there was a white lady who had presented herself as a black lady, and she was a leader, I think, of a local NAACP chapter, and it came out, and she was found out. But yet, I'm like, well, hold on. If you can change genders, then why can't you change races? If that's how I feel, if that's how she felt, oh no, that's unacceptable. Why? Because we took it out of the realm of truth, and now we're creating pseudo realities. So why can't I create my pseudo reality?
I want you to call me by a certain pronoun. You brought this up in a sermon 2 weeks ago, and I was speaking to a first-time guest, and they said, hey, it's not that we didn't think y'all landed on this, but it was so refreshing to hear in the context of the text that this is where we would land.
Yeah, what was very interesting about that text in John 12, when Jesus says, whoever loves his life will lose it. And that I said that word life is the Greek word psyche, which is talking about your mind. And it said is expressed a lot of times as personal pronouns. So that's when I was like, oh, that's kind of crazy. That's a very modern, like the Bible's so relevant, So my mindsets a lot of times are expressed through my personal pronouns. And yet we live in a culture now where we have to declare our personal pronouns, which again, to that question, for a Christian, I would say do not participate in the environment that says you must declare your personal pronouns. Because, and again, people would disagree with me on that. Say, well, I'm trying to reach people, and so therefore I'm going to say mine or he and him, because that's how I identify. But if I put my pronouns in, then I'm participating in the game. I'm approving of the idea that my pronouns could be anything other than what they naturally are, as set by God.
That's a good point.
And so that's where I would counsel people, don't do that. Don't put your pronouns in your social media bio, because you are now starting from a premise of the world, instead of starting from the premise of the Lord and then trying to influence the culture. Because I don't have to express... Again, even I am a male, but my maleness isn't my identity. My Christianness is. I am a Christian male. So my Christianness informs my maleness, not my maleness informing my Christianness. So the only thing I really need in my bio is I'm a follower of Jesus. That's who I am.
Yes.
Now I have a gender. I have a sexuality, but that fundamentally is not who I am.
No, I think it's a great way to clarify how we should respond to pronouns as believers, not to even affirm that there is a possibility that there is a difference.
Yeah, this shows up like theologically, which we said we're going to do a podcast on end times. We haven't even gotten into it. We will at some point. But there's a certain group of end times people that believe a certain way. And if you believe differently than them, then they have a term for you. You're like, oh, you believe this. And I get that question a lot. And I say, no. What? And I was like, because I don't believe your premise that the response is based on.
Right.
So I'm not the opposite of what you think because I don't even believe in what you think. So in the same kind of way is like, I don't have to let them define the categories and then tell you what I am. What I'm saying is I'm not even playing by your categories. I'm playing a different game.
Right. And we probably haven't gotten to half of what we were going to talk about. So we can either do a part 2 at some point. We can go on for another hour.
It's up to you. You know me, I like talking.
What haven't we covered? I know one thing we haven't covered, and I'm going to make this really clear. And I've given people counsel to this where maybe they have a son or a daughter who is in a same-sex relationship and they want to bring them to church. And the question is, will they feel safe here?
Yeah.
And I said, no, they'll feel loved here.
Yeah.
And I said, but if I were you, I would put them into a place where they're going to hear the truth in a loving way.
Yeah.
So we preach through the texts of the Bible, through verses of the Bible, as I say, verse by verse. And
verse by verse.
And if
I can't say it like you did. So.
If you were here at the beginning of the Romans series, and we got to Romans 1:24 through 36, Pastor Jason preached that text. So if that person that asked me the question wants to place their children in an environment where they are going to feel loved, but they're going to get the truth, yes, absolutely bring them.
Of course, yeah. I mean, obviously the church, by definition, is open to everyone.
Yes.
You know, the only time we ever restrict anything, and not just in the area of sexuality, is when people want to take a step in leadership here. You know, that's where we restrict things, and that's by definition, you know. So you can be a part of our church, attend, participate in a lot of the life of the church and not believe the way that we believe. But once you are ready to take a step towards Christ, which again, this is what I think is important to frame it this way. Like I said at the very beginning, that's what God asks all of us to do. Not just same-sex attracted people, not just people that feel like they were born in the wrong body. You know, they're struggling with gender dysphoria, whatever. God calls all of us to do that. You know, it's like when Peter was said to Jesus, we've left everything and followed you. And then Jesus says, I know, and you will be rewarded for that. What we're saying is we're all called to leave everything. When Peter said we've left everything, included in that everything is your sexuality. And that's the call for all of us. And so the call for people that are struggling with what the Bible would call sexual immorality is not any different. And that's the problem a lot of times with Christians is we have not framed discipleship that way for everyone. And that would be the last thing I was going to say is that Jesus calls all of us to deny ourselves, to leave everything and follow him. There is not a scenario where we can say, well, I want Jesus as a part of my life. And he can tell me this over here, but he can't tell me this over here. Well, you don't follow Jesus. He is, I'm actually going to talk more, or we talked more about this the last 2 weeks. That is the message. He is worth you leaving everything over. And I think the biggest lie that the world tells people, and then we as Christians can accidentally affirm this when we do affirm actions with people, is when people think, well, if I just give in to these sexual cravings, I will be happy. And that's the lie. In the same way, you know, a heterosexual person who wants to go outside of their marriage relationship and have sex with more than one person, which pretty much everyone struggles with that, especially in their younger years. The lie is if I have many sexual partners, I will be happy. I mean, that's Hugh Hefner theology.
Right.
And what we're experiencing now is the same thought worked itself out in different ways. Well, if I give in to my same-sex attraction, I will be happy. If I give in to this feeling that I need to cross genders, I will be happy. That's the lie. Is no, you won't. You won't be happy.
That's right.
You will only be happy when your life is hidden in Christ and you leave everything for him. And the call for every one of us is to leave everything, because that is where happiness is found.
I chased after everything for decades, thinking it was going to make me happy. It was the next fix.
Yeah.
And it turns out it didn't.
Yeah.
And it's only Christ. It's only Jesus.
And that's where I would encourage parents, particularly, because we hear this a lot. Well, I just want my kid to be happy. Okay, I do too. I got 2 kids. I want my kids to be happy. But what's going to make my kids happy is not sexuality, no matter how it comes out, whether it's same sex, whatever it is. What's going to make my kid happy is for them living for the purpose that they were made for, which was Christ, to pursue him, love him, enjoy him. And so when parents say, I just want to make my kids happy, so I'm going to affirm their behaviors, then you're lying to them. Because you're lying, you're sending an unintentional message that says, if you give into this, then you'll be happy. And you won't.
Right. I think it's a great place to end this podcast, unless there was anything else. I don't have your hair or your mind, so I can't read it.
Yeah. Oh, one last thing.
One more thing.
One more thing, which goes to what I was just saying. But I want to, and I did this last year in John, that realize all teaching is tied to someone.
That's right.
So again, going back to this thought of like, well, if they give into this, they'll be happy. Well, who told you that? And that's what we all have to ask ourselves. That's what God asked Adam and Eve when he walked in and they had sinned. He said, who told you that? We have an entire generation, and every generation, we have to ask ourselves this question: who told us that? Where did this teaching come from? Because all teaching is tied to someone. And the essence of the teaching of the world is not tied to the Spirit of God. So if I believe that teaching, then I'm tying myself to that teacher, which that's not Jesus. And that's what we have to be so careful about, which is why I say loving people is not lying to them. Because if I lie to them, then I'm teaching them something that's different, that's not tied to Jesus.
Yeah. And think about how you respond to someone, because you've got one shot at your first response. And that one shot could mean the difference between having a relationship and not, or having a strange relationship that takes years to reconnect. I do want to clarify one thing. You were talking about if somebody is in a same-sex relationship and wanted to grow in leadership here.
Yeah.
That would be the ceiling. But if somebody was living together in a heterosexual relationship, we would also look at that as something that would prohibit them from leadership.
Oh, of course.
Okay.
Yes.
So I just want to make sure that.
Yes. No, I'm glad. Again, that goes back to the point I said earlier. Anything that the Bible says is sexual immorality would disqualify anybody from leadership, in the sense of saying sex outside of a marriage relationship between a man and a woman would, yes. And to become a leader, you have to affirm, our statement of belief and our expectations. And yes, and I'm glad you said that, because that is what we're saying is you are agreeing to the teaching of the Bible. And the teaching of the Bible is sexual immorality is way bigger than just same sex. Yes, it is. Yeah. People that are not willing to get married or want to still have sex with their boyfriend or live together. No, they wouldn't. That would preclude them from being in leadership.
And I asked that in like group leader interviews.
Yeah.
Are you guys, married?
Yeah.
Because that'd be good.
Yeah, exactly. It's important.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for just being willing to have the tough conversations, but the real conversations, the truth conversations. And we're not going to shy away from having these conversations here on the Grow People podcast. Hope you enjoyed this. Maybe you ingested it in one sitting. Maybe it took you a few commutes to work because this was a little longer. But we're so grateful that you are listening. Share this with your friends and tell them to listen to the Grow People podcast. We'll probably go on a little bit of a hiatus as Pastor Jason goes on his preaching break.
I think we're recording one more before that.
We are going to do that? Okay, we're going to record one more, and then there'll be a short hiatus.
Yeah.
And I just want to thank our producer, our editor, our graphic designer, our statistician, our cameraman. It is Chandler Elder. He does all of those. And our photographer is Mason Bumgarner. And we are just so grateful. We end the podcast in the same way as we always do. The best advice we've ever heard.
Trust God and take a nap.
Trust God, take a nap. We'll see you next time.